For nearly 3 days, this ship had been lying upside down at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The divers entering it were not searching for survivors. They had been sent to recover the bodies of 11 men. 30 meters beneath the surface, the wreck was completely dark. Its corridors were flooded, twisted, and filled with debris. Then one of the divers saw a hand. He reached toward it, expecting to recover another body. But the hand grabbed him back. Somewhere inside the steel tomb, one man was still breathing. He had no light, almost no water, and the small pocket of air keeping him alive was slowly becoming poisonous. But finding Harrison Okene was only the beginning, because after more than 60 hours under pressure, bringing him directly to the surface could kill him. On the morning of May 26, 2013, the tugboat Jascon 4 was working roughly 30 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria. The vessel was supporting an oil tanker near a chevron platform. 12 people were aboard. Among them was 29-year-old Harrison Okene, the ship's cook. Before dawn, Harrison was awake and in the bathroom. Most of the crew were still inside their cabins. Outside, heavy Atlantic swells were striking the tug. Then, at around 5 in the morning, the vessel was overwhelmed. The Jascon 4 rolled violently onto its side. Inside, gravity appeared to change direction. Loose equipment crashed across rooms. Doors became ceilings. Corridors turned into vertical shafts. The lights went out. Water began forcing its way through the vessel. Harrison was thrown from the bathroom. In total darkness, wearing only his underwear, he fought through rising water and tried to understand which way led out, but the ship was already turning upside down. Within moments, the Jascon 4 disappeared beneath the surface. It fell nearly 30 meters and struck the seabed inverted. There was no time for a distress call that could bring immediate rescue. No emergency lighting guided Harrison through the wreck, and because the ship now rested upside down, every space he knew had become almost unrecognizable. Somewhere above him was the surface, but between Harrison and that surface stood several decks of flooded steel. Harrison moved by touch. He pushed through submerged passageways, searching for any space that still contained air. At one point, he found other members of the crew. They tried to move toward an exit. Harrison did not follow them into the flooding. Their voices disappeared. He eventually reached a small compartment where part of the room had not filled with water. Because the ship was upside down, air had become trapped against what had once been the floor. It was not an escape route. It was an air pocket. Harrison climbed onto objects inside the compartment, trying to raise as much of his body as possible above the freezing water. He used pieces of material around him to build a crude platform. The darkness was absolute. He could not see the size of the space. He could not tell whether the water was still rising, and he had no way to know if the air above him would last for minutes or days. The ship creaked around him as it settled into the seabed. Every sound carried through the steel. Harrison could hear movement elsewhere in the wreck. At first, some of it may have been his crewmates. Later, he described hearing fish inside the vessel. He was the only person in that compartment. He had no food, no reliable source of fresh water, and no light. Most terrifying of all, no one on the surface had any reason to believe a man could still be alive inside a tugboat lying 30 meters underwater. An air pocket sounds like safety, but at that depth, it was also a trap. The pressure inside Harrison's compartment was several times greater than the pressure at the surface. With every breath, he consumed oxygen and released carbon dioxide into a sealed space. The danger was not simply running out of air. Carbon dioxide could reach a toxic level first. As it accumulated, Harrison could develop a severe headache, confusion, panic, and eventually lose consciousness. The cold water surrounding him increased the risk of hypothermia, and seawater continued finding small paths into the wreck. Harrison tried to control what he could. He stayed as still as possible. Every unnecessary movement used more oxygen and produced more carbon dioxide. He prayed. He repeated words his wife had sent him before the accident. He listened for any sign that someone knew where he was. Time became impossible to measure. There was no sunrise, no sunset, no clock he could see, only breathing, only darkness, only the slow movement of water beneath him. At some point, Harrison heard activity outside the hull. Divers had reached the wreck. They struck the vessel, searching for a response. Harrison hammered back with what he could find, but 30 meters of seawater, layers of steel, machinery, and the divers' own equipment swallowed the sound. The noise outside eventually stopped. For Harrison, it meant something almost worse than never hearing rescuers at all. They had been close, and they had left without him. On the surface, the situation appeared hopeless. The Jascon 4 had sunk rapidly. 11 crew members were missing. As the hours passed, the operation changed from rescue to recovery. A specialist saturation diving team was brought in to enter the wreck. These divers were capable of working at depth for extended periods. They descended in a pressurized diving bell and moved through the water using helmets, breathing lines, communication cables, and powerful lamps. Even with that equipment, entering the Jascon 4 was dangerous. The wreck was inverted and unstable. Narrow openings could trap an umbilical line. Sharp steel could damage breathing equipment. Sediment reduced visibility. Furniture and machinery no longer rested where they belonged. The divers were not expecting movement. They were expecting bodies. Several had already been recovered. Inside the vessel, a camera mounted on the diver's helmet transmitted the search to the team above. The footage shows an environment of metal walls, cloudy water, and darkness beyond the beam of a lamp. Every doorway led deeper into a structure that had become a maze. Then the diver entered a passageway near Harrison's compartment. For the first time in more than 60 hours, Harrison saw light. The beam passed through the corridor. Harrison moved toward it. From the diver's perspective, a hand appeared in the darkness. After days inside a wreck where everyone was presumed dead, there was only one reasonable assumption. The diver reached toward the hand. It moved, then it grabbed him. The reaction from the surface team was immediate. There was a survivor inside the Jascon 4. The diver turned his camera and found Harrison's face just above the waterline. He was cold, exhausted, and visibly terrified, but conscious. The team asked his name. Harrison answered. That exchange changed the entire operation. The men who had entered the wreck to recover a body now had to solve a rescue problem almost no one had expected. Harrison could not simply hold his breath and follow the diver out. The route through the flooded vessel was complicated and dangerous. He had no diving experience, no protective suit, and no understanding of the equipment. And even if they could move him safely through the wreck, they could not take him directly to normal surface pressure. For more than 60 hours, Harrison's body had been absorbing inert gas under pressure. If that pressure were released too quickly, bubbles could form inside his blood and tissues. The rescue itself could give him decompression sickness. It could paralyze him. It could kill him. The divers first had to stabilize Harrison. They supplied breathing equipment and began preparing him to leave the only space that had kept him alive. For Harrison, that meant making a brutal choice. The air pocket was cold, dark, and slowly poisoning him. But it was familiar. To escape it, he would have to submerge himself and follow strangers through the flooded corridors of an upside-down ship. The team placed diving equipment on him and explained each movement through communications from the surface. He had to trust the breathing supply. He had to trust the diver guiding him. And he had to remain calm inside a wreck where 11 other people had already died. Slowly, Harrison left the air pocket. He moved through the dark passageway while holding the diver's umbilical line. The lights revealed fragments of the ship for only a moment at a time. A doorway, a wall, a cable, then darkness again. Eventually, they reached the opening in the wreck. For the first time since the sinking, there was no steel ceiling above him, but Harrison was still 30 meters underwater. The divers guided him toward the pressurized diving bell waiting nearby. Once inside, the hatch was sealed. Harrison had escaped the Jascon 4. He still could not return to the surface as an ordinary passenger. He was now, medically, in the same position as a saturation diver. The bell carried Harrison upward while maintaining pressure around him. At the surface, it connected to a decompression chamber. Harrison would remain under controlled pressure while the team slowly returned his body to normal atmospheric conditions. This process took roughly another 2.5 days. After surviving more than 60 hours in a flooded wreck, he was finally aboard a rescue vessel, but still separated from the outside world by the walls of a pressure chamber. The slow decompression was essential. At depth, increased pressure causes more inert gas to dissolve into body tissues. A rapid ascent is like opening a carbonated drink too quickly. Gas that was dissolved under pressure can form bubbles as the pressure falls. Inside a human body, those bubbles can block circulation and damage nerves, joints, lungs, and the brain. So, Harrison waited again. This time, however, he had light. He had warmth, and people outside the chamber knew he was alive. When the process was complete, Harrison stepped back into normal air. Of the 12 people aboard the Jascon 4, he was the only survivor. For the rescue team, the moment remained almost impossible to explain. They had entered a wreck expecting to complete a recovery mission. Instead, a hand in the darkness had turned it into one of the most extraordinary underwater rescues ever recorded. The story might have ended with Harrison refusing to approach the ocean again. At first, that seemed likely. He spoke about the terror that remained after the rescue, the darkness, the cold, and the sounds inside the wreck. Survival did not erase what had happened. It meant he had to live with it. But in the years that followed, Harrison made a decision few people could have imagined. He returned to the water. He trained as a commercial diver. The man who had once been guided through a shipwreck without knowing how to use diving equipment learned to work beneath the surface himself. His survival had depended on a chain of unlikely circumstances. The ship had trapped enough air in exactly the right compartment. Harrison had found it in complete darkness. The water had stopped rising before the air disappeared. His body had endured the cold and pressure. The carbon dioxide had not overwhelmed him before the divers arrived, and the recovery team had entered the correct passageway while he was still able to reach them. Remove any one of those events, and the camera inside the Jascon 4 records something very different. Instead, it recorded a dead man's hand reaching back to life. Harrison Okene spent more than 60 hours beneath the Atlantic in a place no rescue team believed could contain a survivor. He had no signal, no light, and almost no control over what happened next. Yet, when a diver finally reached into the darkness, Harrison was still there to grab him. If you want more true stories that seem impossible, subscribe to Meridian Zero, because somewhere between disaster and survival, there is always a moment when everything changes.